From rebelling against the English crown, Americans have always had a rebellious spirit when seeking out justice. Throughout America's history, three movements, fueled by the desires to eradicate discrimination and injustice, have left their mark more than the rest due to their development and length they have been fighting for their rights. These movements are the African American Civil Rights Movement, the Chicano-Chicana Movement, and the Feminist Movement. There are many similarities and differences among these movements, and struggles and victories. However, I believe that the African American Civil Rights Movement had the most success because of the total victories the movement received and the development of the protest movement through its different tactics, which largely influenced the other two movements. Because I regard the Civil Rights Movement as the most successful, I will compare first the Chicano-Chicana movement with the Civil Rights Movement, and then I will compare the Feminist Movement and the Civil Rights Movement. Both the African Civil Rights Movement and the Chicano-Chicana movement were oriented around ethnicity. Both groups faced discrimination in their social, political, and economic lives. For example, in the Civil Rights Movement, while African Americans faced discrimination in industrial workplaces, Chicanos faced discrimination mostly in agricultural workplaces. Both groups suffered from intimidation. African Americans suffered from violent attacks from groups such as the KKK, while Chicanos often faced intimidation when dressed as pachucos, or men who wore zoot suits, because they looked similar to members of the mafia. These attacks and wrongful accusations were fueled by discrimination, and they were rightfully pointed out by figures such as Malcolm X, who demanded that investigations be carried out in events he felt were the cause of police brutality against blacks. Among the two groups, the different tactics used to seek justice were also very similar. However, the African American Civil Rights Movement often provided the guidance for Chicano movement leaders, such as Cesar Chavez. For example, Martin Luther King insisted that nonviolent protests, such as civil disobedience, were the key to obtaining freedom from oppressive laws. One needs only to look at his letter from Birmingham jail to see how much he welcomed and upheld nonviolence tactics. Cesar Chavez would later go on to tell his community of poor farm workers, mostly Chicanos, that Martin Luther King's way was the way goals would become accomplished. And he noted this through his lesson of Martin Luther King. When both groups faced discrimination, still after nonviolence protests, both groups were similar in that they arose to call for more aggressive tactics and the use of empowering their people through pride in their culture. African Americans adopted Black Power, where key figures such as Malcolm X and the Black Panthers advocated the need for African Americans to find pride within themselves in order to find a way to combat the capitalist world they believed was suppressing them through discrimination. The Chicano movement also called for a greater sense of pride and adopted Chicano Power. Some even requested to forge communities such as Aztlán in order to increase cultural pride among Chicanos. Both groups also advocated that education be pursued in order to empower the people and improve their states in the government. Children who were forced to go to different schools or who faced discrimination were often found to be socially affected by those things. So the victories that both groups had in education were significant, such as when courts ruled that schools should not be segregated by race, and for blacks this would lead to the elimination of the belief that separate but equal was a just law. The images you are now seeing are of W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, both African American figures who supported the education of African Americans in order to seek out political and social improvement. The counterpart in the Chicano movement was the Daily Jalapeno, which was a newsletter composed by groups for the Chicano movement which included their views on discrimination in schools. Some notable differences among the groups included how Chicanos were split due to their varying skin tones. Unlike most African Americans, many Chicanos were treated a bit more fairly because they had lighter complexions. However, this unfair treatment often caused resentment and envy within Chicanos themselves. The Chicano movement protested against this unfair treatment because they could see how it was splitting and crippling their movement. Another difference was that Chicanos could identify with neither whites nor blacks, so they demanded to have their own identity. The category Latino had been developed in order to allude to roots in European ancestry, and thus this would bring them closer to whites than blacks, and it was done in an effort to obtain more rights. However, they still faced discrimination. Both groups had to suffer political discrimination also under voting rights due to literacy tests, but people who sought to intimidate the two minorities also applied literacy tests, especially on Chicanos, in an effort to discourage them economically, either from purchasing American goods or moving into the States. Now, to compare the feminist movement and the African civil rights movement is a little more difficult because there were several different groups within the feminist movement, including some that were deeply involved in the African civil rights movement. The most notable groups of feminists in my argument will be black women feminists, middle class feminists, and professional women feminists. To begin, the main similarities shared by both protest movements were the tactics that they used to raise awareness and seek justice. However, the feminist movement was largely influenced by the African American civil rights movement. A difference, however, is that women, unfortunately, have had to wait longer for many of their rights. In fact, women still do not receive equal pay in comparison to some positions that men have. Regardless, both groups called out to the ethos of the Constitution in order to justify rights to voting. Shulamith Firestone also reveals that the black struggle and feminine struggle always seem to run parallel in this country, which indicates how closely tied the two movements are. In fact, many women activists first gained experience advocating for rights in the African American civil rights movement. However, ironically, women often face discrimination in organizations advocating for equal rights for African Americans. For that reason, Francis Beale justly names African American women as the slave of a slave, and poor African American women were often viewed as the bottom of the economic totem pole because they faced discrimination and they were often left with jobs such as caretakers of white families. Where African Americans saw oppression from white supremacy, women saw oppression from male supremacy. Interestingly, Gloria Steinem illustrates a situation in which men could find a basis on supremacy had they been born with the menstrual cycle instead of women. The purpose of her discussions is to call women to fight for their rights and to not allow men to justify any means of supremacy. As I mentioned earlier, African Americans were eager to pursue an education in order to improve, but women also sought more opportunities through education. All women faced discrimination in workplace opportunities because it was believed that the positions that they were after were only fitting of men. This was one way that men inflicted supremacy on women. Another way was that women were often tied to the home due to bearing many children and having to take care of the housework. But women such as Margaret Sanger advocated the development of birth control because she knew it would empower women in having the power to make decisions that could affect their social and economic opportunities. New technological appliances would also affect middle-class women because it would free more time for them, being that housework could be done faster, and that way women could pursue other interests. However, women's role in the anti-lynching movement was most beneficial to the African American civil rights movement. The efforts of the Crusaders, even by selling fruitcakes in order to raise funds, were significant in the movement for African American civil rights. But there were many women who were still discriminated against. The similarities among all three groups are evident. For example, all three movement groups saw opportunities to better their social, political, and economic situations through enlisting in the armed forces in times of war. Minorities, both men and women, were able to gain access to higher skills and jobs by joining the armed forces, and the wars gave the minorities experience for calling out injustice back home, such as when the NAACP compared the African Americans' position in the U.S. with that of the Jews in Germany. Women gained more respect as it was obvious that they could perform the same job as men. However, because the development of the African American civil rights movement was the most thorough via sit-ins, marches, and riots, they led the other movements influentially, and their successes were also most thorough, since women continued to demand for more equality.